So, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Andrew Head. Andrew is currently an assistant professor at University of Pennsylvania. Before that, he was a PhD student at UC Berkeley and postdoctoral researcher at the Allen Institute for AI. That's where we initially met. Andrew has done a bunch of cool work on human-computer interactions, and his group focuses on new interaction mechanisms to help people comprehend complex texts, like scientific papers, source code, clinical notes. Andrew has received many Best Paper awards and honorable mention awards at premier conferences like CHI and in CHI like HCI. And today he'll talk about how to augment the presentation of maths in scholarly documents. Right, Andrew, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you, Shannon.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Hi everyone. For those of you who are there in person today, well done on getting through the snow in Boston. For those of you who will be joining online later, good to see you, and it is a real privilege to be a part of this talk series. When I heard that Shannon was putting together a mini course on visual aspects of scientific communication, I thought it just sounded like an awesome course that I would have loved to take. And it is really fun for me to be able to share a little bit of what I've been thinking about in this setting. So today I want to talk about visual design and scientific formulas. And I think scientific formulas is something that perhaps doesn't get quite as much thought when we think about them as a target for potential design within our scientific communication. Scientific formulas are incredibly pervasive. We use them in our scientific communication, whether our domain is machine learning, data science, computer graphics, human-computer interaction, or any number of other fields that have formal underpinnings. Oftentimes, math notation is the way that is a really expeditious way to communicate ideas with those formal underpinnings. To choose an example for my own domain, here is the Fitts law formula, which is a formula that predicts the amount of time that it takes a user to point to a target on the screen. This is kind of like a canonical formula from HCI. And by looking at just this formula out of context, one of the things that I think it also demonstrates is that math notation can be difficult to understand. There's oftentimes math notation is often not self-explanatory, and so we need to find certain ways of being able to unpack its meaning for readers, which leads us to this question: can we present our formulas in ways that make them easier to understand? This talk comprises 3 different chapters. In our first chapter, we're going to talk about how formulas are read, taking a perspective from the learning sciences. And then later on, we'll talk about specific design patterns by which we might be able to make the meanings of formulas more approachable, and some research in my group around trying to build better toolkits for being able to visually design and communicate with formulas. But let's first start talking about how formulas are read. And in order to do this, I want to talk about what I think is one of the most fun to read papers in this area, which is the paper How Students Understand Physics Equations by Bruce Sharon. What Bruce did was he observed 5 pairs of physics students doing whiteboard problems for 27 hours, and then found around 200 instances of talking around formulas, and tried to kind of back solve the types of cognitive structures that were in people's brains on the basis of those conversations. So Bruce's question was something like, how would you describe a formula like this one? You might recognize this formula as one of the key formulas that appears early on within a physics class, which describes how you can compute the velocity at a particular point in time. One of the students in this study described it as follows. Well, velocity, that's the v, will equal to v naught if it's not being disturbed. So it's like whatever it is, and then plus a correction on the acceleration. And then what Bruce did was he did some analysis of these descriptions in order to find these common figures that might suggest what was going on in people's heads. So for instance, when someone said something like, whatever it is, and then plus a correction, this was indicative that they were processing the formula in a particular way that noticed that there was a base and there was a change. And in this, this is a particular one of these figures that came up very often, which is interpreting these formulas as a base plus a change. And Bruce ended up distilling this down into a number, into a set of many different, what he called symbolic forms, where a symbolic form is a pair of a symbol template and an accompanying conceptual schema, or you could think of it as an interpretation. So with a symbol template like having an expression, plus or minus, some other expression that represents a delta, the corresponding schema or explanation is that you've got these two contributing terms, but they play different roles. One of them is a base value, and another one is a change to the base. And our interpretation of formulas oftentimes involves the identification of these symbolic forms and then ascribing meanings towards them from those conceptual schemas. And there are many, 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 many of these symbolic forms. What is more, these symbolic forms also vary across domains. So in Bruce's words, although some forms may have wide applicability, some more idiosyncratic semantics may be specific to individual domains and applications within domains. So in other words, each domain, whether it's machine learning, data science, human-computer interaction, programming languages, is likely to have its own conventions for what meanings are implied by the symbols in their formulas. So when people don't understand a formula, what could be going awry? The first thing that might go awry is maybe someone just fails to recognize the individual symbols within a formula. Here I've scraped a particular example from an ICML 2020 poster talk. That's, I think, representative of many, many, many technical talks that we see that puts a very large formula like this on the screen. And one of the things that you recognize is that in order to understand this formula, you have to understand the gist of what F and X, a C, a K, a tau, an L, and so on and so forth, what all of these mean before you even start thinking about these larger structures. And so many times we just kind of have an uphill battle of having to establish that initial vocabulary of individual symbols. But reason too that we can learn from Bruce Sharon is our comprehension can go awry when we fail to recognize forms appropriately. And this can happen in all kinds of different ways. Here's a particular example from the physics, from that research article about physics, where this particular formula, the way that it was supposed to be interpreted is that on the left side of this formula, you have the total forces that are applied to a particular object. And on the right side of this object, on the right side of this formula, it is solely a term representing the force from friction. In other words, the only force that applies to this object is the force from friction. And then you can manipulate the mass terms, the acceleration terms, the mu terms, and so on and so forth in order to derive additional facts on this basis. And the funny thing in this study is that there was this one participant, this one student, who ended up misinterpreting this left side of this formula that they had actually written with their partner to mean the initial force that applied to that object before friction came into play. And this was in part because of a misreading of the symbolic forms. Equals sometimes appears within physics equations to suggest a balance between multiple distinct forces, where you have something on the left-hand side, something on the right-hand side. They're both balanced opposing forces. And so this particular student thought that this meant that there was an initial force that was equal to the force from friction that eventually applied, while it was actually quite different. It was a statement of definition that all of the forces could be described with just the force from friction. And the funny thing is that this particular student had just solved the problems using these formulas and then went back and had this misinterpretation. So and the lesson that should be taken away from this is that the structures in a formula are ambiguous. The structures in a formula might imply multiple meanings, not just equals means definition, but maybe equals means balance, and so on and so forth. You can think about other ways that pluses and dots and arrows and those kinds of things might have multiple possible meanings in a formula. Readers might need to be guided in understanding the correct meanings that are associated with those structures. So now that we have this kind of framework for thinking about formulas as the identification of individual symbols and those symbolic forms, and then assimilating meaning out of those, This raises the question of how can we show notation in a way that it might be better understood? So here's where I want to start transitioning and talking about some of the research that's been going on within my group, specifically around math notation and its presentation, and how we can build up new ways of thinking about augmentations and tooling for augmentations to help support its understanding. This next chapter of my talk is going to be about augmenting math notation, and it's going to be based on a talk that we presented at ACM Chi, which is one of the leading HCI conferences. So there are many ways in which we could embellish notation in order to try to improve the reading experience around it. One of the things that we can do is, for instance, assume that you had something like this equation for a line as it might appear within an algebra classroom. I know all of us on this call might likely already know how to read this, but if you approach this with fresh eyes and you think about how if you try to kind of put those acquired meanings aside for a moment, and imagine yourself in a beginner's perspective, there's a couple of ways in which this notation might be made more accessible. One approach is that you could add descriptive labels. For instance, just adding in the margin that this y corresponds to the height of a point on a line, this x corresponds to that point's horizontal position, this m is a multiplicative scaling factor called the slope, and this b is some constant offset that's used to compute that height. Another approach is that you could relate this particular representation of the formula to other explanations using color. So let's say in the margins of your document, you had something like this graphic right here, which shows the computation of the height of a point on a line. You could colorize this formula in such a way that suggests that the height of the point on this line can be computed by taking that constant offset, then taking the horizontal position of that line, scaling it by the slope, and adding it all together in order to compute that height. To apply this back to my favorite example from HCI, Fitts law once again, for those of you who haven't seen this before, what you can, in this way, we could unpack the meaning of it by saying something like, the time that it takes to point to a particular target on a screen is, it increases as you increase the distance to that target. It decreases as you increase the width of that target, you make it more broad. And it involves some fixed amount of delay, no matter what you're pointing to. And then there's also this task-specific coefficient that you pick, whether you're on a mobile screen, or you're using your laptop, or you're using your desktop with a mouse. That's what that B corresponds to here. And simply adding those labels in the margins has a way of making this formula a lot more accessible. And these are all instances of what we call in our research math augmentation, which is visually embellishing math notation in order to improve how it is read. One of the exciting things about living in this particular era of academic scholarly publishing is that people are increasingly experimenting with different types of math augmentation, bringing augmented math into their research papers, such as this passage, which uses colorization to kind of visually chunk this rather complex formula and relate it to nearby definitions in a nearby passage. They're using math augmentation within their slides. Here's an example of another ICML 2020 slide deck that uses labels to describe the meanings of these longer expressions. They're augmenting math within their teaching materials, like these lecture notes. And they're also doing it in these more kind of public-facing, broader audience publications. If any of you have read Distill articles, for instance, this is one example of a Distill article that makes use of this kind of idiomatic, idiomatic to distill practice of math augmentation of spacing apart meaningful expressions and assigning descriptions to each of those meaningful expressions. And the reason that all of this works is due to simple perceptual, perceptual abilities that we all have that are well known within the HCI domain. So for instance, like one of those sets of principles are the Gestalt principles, where the Gestalt principles are a number of different principles that talk about how people mentally group visual marks together on the basis of different properties of those marks. such as similarity, proximity, symmetry, closure. To name a couple of these that are particularly relevant to formulas, there's proximity. So the closer two particular expressions are together, the more likely someone is to conceptually group them together. So that means you can take something like this velocity formula, and if you want to suggest what the major kind of conceptual chunks of it are, you can introduce space into it in a way that suggests that on the right-hand side, you have these two main conceptual chunks. It's the base and it's the change, and you don't necessarily have to subdivide further than that. You can also use the similarity of the marks in order to help people with the formation of these conceptual groups. And one of the ways that you can do this is with color. So for instance, if you want to show that A and T are part of the same conceptual unit, you can assign them the same color, suggesting, this is all part of the same concept. It is part of change. There's another aspect of our perceptual ability which accounts for some of the gains that you can get from augmenting your math, and that's pre-attentive features. So in just a moment, I'm going to show on the screen a box, and it has a bunch of blue dots in it and a single red dot. What I want you to do is I want you to try to find that red dot as quickly as possible. I'll show it in 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, so this was probably a trivial task for you. You were probably able to find that red dot amidst those blue dots incredibly quickly. One of the things that you might note is that you can do this a lot faster than sometimes, finding a specific word on a page of written text. And one of those reasons, and that reason is because of this thing called pre-attentive features, which is where some visual properties like color, they're processed pre-attentively. So they essentially get kind of a fast pass in the brain where you don't have to do focused scanning in order to find them. And because of this, you can colorize text and formulas in a way to reduce the amount of time it takes someone to find definitions of expressions within that formula. Going back to our favorite physics formula here, you could highlight that v sub 0 in red, and you could also highlight its explanation in the text in red as well, in order to help someone really rapidly go back and forth between the two of them. So all of this to say, the idea of visually embellishing some of your notation in order to make it more approachable, it's really just kind of founded on these well-known principles from perception. Our goals in our research for this particular project was first to identify the design space of different augmentations that authors are already applying to their formulas in order to help them be better understood. And then second, I'm a tool builder. I like to build interesting interactive systems. One of the things that we wanted to do was to characterize what authors' tools should do to help them augment their formulas better. And to this end, we undertook a mixed method study. This mixed method study comprised first of this content analysis of 47 math documents and many formulas from them that had been augmented with a detailed qualitative analysis, and then conducting interviews with a number of authors who had created these augmentations to understand their goals and their process. Our content analysis was this kind of deep, was this deep and rather involved process around these math documents, where 2 of us coders on the research team each inspected around 281 formulas. We classified and counted the augmentations. We made around 8,000 judgments apiece. And this took place over the course of around 50 hours each or so. So in short, we took a look at a lot of math documents in very close detail. And this ended up leading to this space of different augmentations that people were applying to their notation, which fell into these 4 categories. The first was visual notation, where people put visual marks and embedded visualizations in place of expressions within formulas. There was text styling, which was the use of colorization, spacing, and opacity on expressions in order to kind of draw attention. There was the use of annotations, such as labels, in order to attach meaning or to associate different types of marks on the page. And there was also interactivity, wherein readers could play around with expressions within a formula and see them affect other types of computations. And across these 4 different categories, we observed 16 different kinds of augmentations. The design space involved in any one of these particular augmentations could actually be rather nuanced. So let's take the example of just labeling formulas. What we saw is that with labels, you can use them in many different ways. For instance, they can contain text, they can contain illustrative visuals, they can contain yet more notation that helps to describe the expressions that you're trying to describe. They can apply to overlapping expressions, describing formulas at multiple levels of resolution. And some of these labels could actually apply to additional labels, clarifying the contents of those other labels. All of this to say, the set of things that one can do in order to augment their formulas is actually rather broad, and perhaps our tools should be able to support us in being able to do to really be able to find those augmentations that are fit for the particular purpose. Our conversations with the authors also led to a set of design recommendations for better authoring tools to help be able to unlock some more of the possibilities around effective math explanation. We came up with 11 design recommendations for a number of different kinds of future tools, including markup languages, graphical editors, and automated tools. A few of these recommendations are as follows. First, tools should help authors color formulas and the content that those formulas relate to. One of the most common patterns that we saw in documents was their use of color to highlight important expressions and relate them to explanations and representations elsewhere in the document. For instance, here's an example passage from one of the documents, which colorized one of the functions green, and then also colorized the curve related to that function in nearby visualization green as well, in order to, once again, allow people to really rapidly go back and forth between those 2 representations. This was the most common kind of augmentation that we observed, and it's one that should probably be easier for us to do with our existing tools. Another recommendation is that tools should support details on demand in animation. Authors often felt limited by the static media that they wrote in, and some believe that formulas could be better explained with more dynamic presentations of those formulas that convey the meaning of the formula with fewer words and visual marks. One way in which you could provide these more dynamic presentations is to expose explanations at variable levels of detail. For instance, initially presenting a formula with a set of these kind of static high-level explanations, and then allowing people to drill down into the explanations of individual expressions by clicking on them. Another kind of dynamic presentation that could be employed would be to present derivations as animations of a formula. One of the authors talked about a passage they had written where they described a derivation as a series of a single formula that they were continuing to transform, and descriptions of those transformations in the text. And what this author wanted instead was, they described how they think it might be better if you could just show these transformations on the formula. For instance, highlighting a particular term that was about to be distributed and showing it slide into its new positions, the next stage in the derivation. A third recommendation is to make markup languages easier to read and write. A formula like this one that involved just 8 colorizations of different expressions involved markup code that looked kind of like this, and which could be messy and tangled up, where the specification of the underlying formula was tangled in with all of this extra stuff, which specified the colors. And a better way of expressing this might instead be, for instance, allowing people to express the formula as just the formula, and then allowing them to write out some presentation markup, maybe in like a CSS-like language, that would then apply across the different expressions within that formula, and where individual styles could apply to multiple expressions. The main takeaways from that particular chapter of work is, first, this design space of augmentations. And those of you who are interested in what is possible, I encourage you to take a look at our paper where we have tons of examples and a detailed description of each of the individual augmentations. So that was one of our contributions. And the other one is this view into the ways that authors already augment notation and different ways that our tools might be able to adapt to help us do it better. And that brings me to the third chapter of this talk, which is different types of visual design toolkits that we might one day have to allow us to present our notation more effectively. This last project was led by Zed Wu, and it's called FFL, a language and live runtime for styling and labeling typeset formulas. It appeared at WIST just a couple of months ago. And for this part of the talk, I'm going to transition to PowerPoint because Zed made some great slides for this in PowerPoint. And I think express the way that the tool works rather well. So imagine you have a passage, a formula like this one, and the accompanying text that describes it like this one. And perhaps one of the things that you want to do is to colorize the text in such a way that allows that rapid access of definitions within the text. If someone were to try to do this type of colorization in LaTeX today, it would look kind of like this, where one of the things that you can notice is that in order to colorize N, you need to add these text color commands, and you need to add them in multiple different places. And what becomes perhaps most pernicious is the work involved in having to maintain all of this markup in order to bring about these augmentations. And here you can see all of the different nested curly braces that are involved in this particular augmentation, which with a tool like LaTeX is simply really rather difficult to manage. And if someone was to want to try and change the color here, what they would have to do is go through each individual instance, change magenta to orange or another color or something like that. Which led us to ask the question, what would it look like to have better markup languages for doing these kinds of augmentations? We posited that a language for augmenting math formulas should make it easy to style and label formulas. It should allow repeated augmentations for repeated symbols, for instance, applying the same color to an expression over an entire span of text. It should have easy to read syntax. It should integrate with common web authoring environments, as scientific publishing increasingly starts to adopt HTML, JavaScript, those types of things, can we make it integrate well with that? It should also provide live feedback to allow people to test out a lot of different augmentations quickly. What that language might look like is something like what you can see right here, which we call FFL for Formula Formatting Language, kind of as an homage to CSS, Cascading Style Sheets. And when you look at the FFL, you can see that individual lines in it describe specific expressions that it should find in the text and augmentations that should apply to it. And it does so in this concise format such that you can change the definition of a style in one place, and then it'll apply to all matching expressions across the document. That's the basic idea. Now let's talk a little bit more about the language design around FFL and how we're trying to kind of map this to enabling more rapid iteration with the types of augmentations at people's disposal. An FFL specification consists of a selector, such as that N, and a particular a description of the augmentation you want to apply, like this deep pink color. And these selectors can be of multiple types. They can be these literal selectors, which within $signs just refers to the LaTeX for the expression you want to find elsewhere on the page. It also can involve wildcards. So for instance, if you want to match all fractions with a single character denominator, you can use this selector right here with the glob style star and question mark. The full specification for the FFL language goes a lot farther with things like nth selectors, subscripts, superscripts. It involves a number of different common CSS styles like color and font weight, and also a number of FFL specific augmentations and overrides like labels and our particular implementation of background color. And what we've done is we've actually built out a tool that will parse FFL and then apply it within your web authoring environment. Here you can see an instance of an example web authoring editor where someone is changing color augmentations to a number of different label augmentations, where those labels are getting automatically laid out in the margins of a display formula. And so we've actually built this out. In a minute or two, I'll tell you how you can play around with it yourself. So now that you have a sense of what the language design looks like, let's talk about how you build a system that can perform this kind of augmentation within modern web authoring stacks. With FFL, you have a style sheet which specifies the augmentations you want to apply to your math. And you also have the LaTeX source corresponding to the formula that's going to get rendered on the page. The first step, the first thing that FFL does behind the scenes is it tokenizes the LaTeX source, splitting it into a sequence of tokens using an off-the-shelf LaTeX parser. In our case, it's Katek. The next thing it does is it parses the style sheet. In this case, it takes the style sheet and it turns it into a bit of CSS that's going to apply in the rendered to the HTML. And then it also comes up with a particular token subsequence that it's going to try to find in the tokenized LaTeX, and a generated class name for that style in the generated CSS. It then looks for all instances of that selector within the parsed token stream. And then when it finds them, it then surrounds those instances with these special markers that when you end up rendering this LaTeX source into a formula, it's going to end up adding that the particular generated class name around that expression in the rendered version of the HTML, such that the generated CSS that we've generated will apply automatically to it when it's just rendered by the browser. So that's the overall process for how we process LaTeX and the FFL to allow this kind of real-time augmentation. And it gets a little bit more involved when you think about things like labels, where you have to insert additional padding and arrange the labels in the right place. But what I've shown you is the basic idea. And the reason that we should think about having some of these tools is implied by the evaluation that we've done to date. So we did an in-lab usability study with 33 participants. And we had them both create and edit augmentations using both FFL and a LaTeX baseline. What we observed is, first, using FFL significantly reduced the amount of time that it took to complete tasks involved in editing complex augmentations. So we ended up seeing around kind of 20 to 25% speed up even after a very short amount of training time with FFL for participants in the study for being able to manipulate augmentation code. We also saw that participants, in the slide that you can see here, what you can see is essentially a stacked bar chart where dark blue corresponds to strong agreement or great ease, whereas dark red corresponds to great difficulty using the tool. And what you can see is that participants consistently found it significantly easier to complete the task with FFL than with LaTeX. And they also found it significantly easier to read the styling code and the specification with FFL than they did with LaTeX. There's a lot of reasons that account for this greater ease. One reason is that FFL simply had decreased error proneness relative to LaTeX, where earlier I talked about how half of the battle with LaTeX is simply just managing curly braces involved in augmentations. FFL eliminated that class of errors. There are other reasons that FFL seemed to improve matters. One of the reasons is that it made it easier to make changes that applied to multiple symbols. It involves fewer hard mental operations with fewer kind of moving pieces where people were just trying to keep track of all of the things they had to change within that markup code. And participants also reported the live feedback that the tool provided as useful. Now, there are also opportunities for improvements, and this project is really kind of a starting point for some of the tool building work that we're doing these days, where we found that FFL could benefit from further improvements in the learning curve of the syntax, and the discoverability of the constructs, and better error recognition and recovery tools, and other aspects as well. And furthermore, I think that one thing that we should be thinking about too is can we go beyond markup languages as well to, for instance, allow people to directly select expressions within a document and maybe generate placeholder pieces of FFL that they could write and modify? And then another aspect of documents that we have to acknowledge is the fact that oftentimes documents use expressions in multiple senses within that same document. For instance, even the symbol X might in one place refer to a single bit of data, in another place a vector. And in this way, it's also important to think about some of these augmentation tools as having scopes of applicability within a document rather than just one place. And that requires some really kind of nuanced design work as well. For those of you who are interested in this particular project and this particular vision of augmentation, you should definitely check out Zed's work. On the screen, you can see a QR code, and you can also see a link to a page where you can play around with FFL on your own. We built FFL such that it could be plugged into other web authoring environments. So it has a very simple API for incorporation. And so it's something that you can start out on our playground. And also, if you're in the business of building authoring tools, you should see if FFL might make sense as a part of yours. Okay, so the lessons that I hope are learned after all of this is simply the takeaways I want you to take is, first, that readers might need help in understanding symbols in your formulas, and they might need help in understanding symbolic forms in your formulas. And furthermore, that labels, colors, and spacing are all at your disposal to present the meanings of your formulas. These happen to be some of the most common augmentations that we saw before. And with that, I think this is a good time to open it up for discussion. I think that there are a lot of interesting things that we could talk about if folks want to take a little bit of time. For instance, we could talk about what tools could you use to change the visual design of your formulas. For instance, if you're working with LaTeX or making slides. We could talk about, from a critical perspective, what are the pitfalls of some of these styles of augmentations. If you're interested in this as a research direction, I'd also be happy to share a bit more about what our group is working on in this space. If there are any questions or if anyone wants to start a discussion, I would be very happy to.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Andrew. This is, it's always a joy to watch your talks. And then this is one of the best talks I've seen for quite a long time. And of course, I love the math augmentation work. And, the moment I saw FFL, I think it's such a brilliant idea. I just want to use it right away. So let me move the camera, and then so you can see us. But then, yeah, I think, happy to also ask any questions or yeah, please, yeah.
So I have a question, that's so can we use this FFL on LaTeX already? Because it would be great. It would actually be fantastic to be able to use it.
So you can't use FFL on LaTeX. We thought a lot about whether we could make this for something for LaTeX. And let me try to page back into my mind all of the technical reasons that you can't do this on LaTeX. The TLDR of this is that the kernel of Tech was created in 1983 by Don Knuth. And that kernel is, it's not very easy to change. It has a very low level view of the individual symbols. And so there's no API that, for instance, will get you all of the symbols and all of the bounding boxes of those symbols. So I have yet to completely throw out the possibility of backporting some of this stuff to existing LaTeX engines like PDF LaTeX. You might be able to do some clever things around creating auxiliary representations of the LaTeX files and doing kind of post scanning on it and alterations of the LaTeX and stuff. It might be possible, it's extremely technically involved. And so that's why for the moment, we've started thinking about web authoring frameworks because it's something where extension is a lot easier. We think in the long term, scholarly publishing will probably move in that direction. And if we get the design really, really, really right in web authoring, then maybe it would be worth backporting some of that stuff to PDF LaTeX if possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, LaTeX is a bit has been around for a while. It's probably hard to tinker with. Yeah, I have other questions, but I don't know if anyone else. Anyone? Oh,
Go for it.
oh, cool. Yeah, the other thing I was going to ask is, so you talked about many ways of presenting equations. I guess generally speaking, from your experience, are there particular techniques that are particularly effective for most people, like say using color as opposed to using labels? Or does this just vary depending on many factors? Obviously, depending on some media, like on a paper, you can't have interactivity. So yeah, I don't know. Are there any particular trade-offs?
Yeah, sure. So the three most common types of augmentation that we observed in our study was first color, and then labels, and then spacing. And my guess is that the reason that those are the most common is that they are relatively easy to implement and relatively easy to get right. We actually saw interactivity incredibly rarely, and I think one of the reasons being that like it's hard to implement, and also like it's hard to think about a way of doing that that's like really productive for understanding individual formulas. So I would think that colors, labels, and spacing would be your mainstays. For me, for my personal tastes, I think that labels should probably deserve kind of top billing in terms of the things that people consider doing with their formulas. The main reason being that color, for all of its advantages and for all of its ease of use, it also has a lot of visual pop to it. And so any place that you apportion your attention to within a scholarly document is some place that you're not giving your attention to somewhere else. So you can imagine that if someone is going to skim your scholarly document, if you've colorized it in some way, probably people's eyes are going to be, drawn to those colors very quickly. I see labels as a little bit more versatile in that, like, I think they're unambiguously helpful for understanding how to kind of mentally chunk some of these labels, but they don't necessarily impose the same kind of attentional tax as color does. That's the way my own personal tastes work. And one of the things that like I would love to do, maybe we'll end up doing in the next couple of years, is actually put some of those ideas to the test and see if we can observe some of those changes in ways that documents are perceived and experienced. But those are just some of my own expectations.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Oh, I can also yell if you
Oh.
can hear me. I was just curious if you have seen any good examples in terms of like scientific communications of good usage of some of the techniques and findings you discussed.
Sure, yeah. So let me pull up on my screen here. So one of the things that I'd encourage, if you go to our math augmentation paper, which you can find on my website, you can scroll down. So we've got tons of examples in this paper. You can see a lot of these kind of 2-column length figures that have lots of these examples. And then at the very end, we have this appendix where we list out a whole bunch of different examples of these documents that we reviewed. I think some of my own favorite examples are, before we already talked about, we already reviewed, I showed an example from Muhammad et al.'s continuous prefetch paper where they have one of the things I really like here is that they have this colorization for these really mammoth expressions here. And so I think that, like, you know, to me, the value of chunking these formulas becomes is proportional to the length of expression. The longer the expression, the more valuable it is to provide a little bit of chunking assistance. And so that's one of the things that I love about the colorization in this particular paper here. One of my colleagues, so I'm actually a co-author on one of these papers. It's mostly Fred's work. This is the point at which I actually became first aware of this practice and kind of led me down this research route. But Fred has this passage where This is an HCI paper, and he's trying to describe the intuition behind GAMs. And he starts with just talking about kind of a generalized linear model in the first place. And so he uses these colors to suggest that there's just kind of only these 4 conceptual chunks in this linear model, even though there's a lot of symbols. So there's the target, there's the constant offset, and then you've got the weights, and then you've got the features. And so you just have to be aware of those 4 aspects rather than 8 individual expressions. And so I think that this was a pretty tasteful example from Fred's work. Another thing that I would also encourage taking a look at is, if you haven't yet taken a look at distill articles, a ton of work goes into distill articles to try to think about effective visual design that's going to be accessible to people and inspire, to try to make what is some of the most complex mathematical ideas approachable to a more broad technical audience. And so Distill has examples of formulas like, let's see, like this one right here, where they use space in order to chunk up the formulas, and also these labels right next to it to describe them. And one of the things that I think is really cool about these descriptions, that is like another thing that you could run a study on to see whether it's productive enough or not, is the fact that you can actually read these labels from left to right in order to come up with the sentence that describes the formula as a whole. So this says, we can think of negative y sub I to the k as velocity, which is dampened at each step and perturbed by an external force field. I think it's just really nice. It's visually crisp, and I think it's just beautifully done. So that's a few examples that I would share of things that I think are quite well done.
That's really great, thank you.
Yeah, please.
Oh, so the other question that I had is kind of broad. Oh, thank you. The other question that I had is kind of broad. I feel like even in just within the field, let's say machine learning, different authors tend to have different ways of writing the same kind of mathematical formula or concept. I'm just generally curious if you thought about ways in which that can be mitigated, because a lot of the times I'll look at a concept and I'll be like, I think I know what you're saying, but this doesn't look like what I am used to. But yeah, just very curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if there's a general solution to that problem, but if I was thinking about it from a tooling perspective, I would say you have 2 options. You can try to influence how communication happens for the individual authors, or you can try to influence the way that formula is going to be received by a reader. Let's talk about it from the author perspective for a second. So we're increasingly getting these AI augmented writing tools that can do things like not just check for grammatical issues, but detect when you have a dense passage, or suggest alternative ways of phrasing something. You can imagine something similar for writing formulas, where let's say you write out your particular formula, maybe it scans the surrounding text to try to understand what it is that you're writing about, and maybe it also scans in the 20 papers that you're citing to get a sense of kind of the neighborhood of the ways that people are describing the same ideas. And then maybe it can come back to you and it can say, well, you wrote this formula, but a different way of writing it would be this one. And this corresponds to this one very widely cited paper that you've just, that you're already citing in your own paper. Maybe you want to do this instead. And my guess is that you could probably get an LLM to actually propose that specific formula that should be written instead. And so one of the things that might be able to do is help find more common ways of expressing a particular formalism. And then, the task of the author would then be say, consider this formalism introduced by this other author. What we do is we make this additional change on top of it. So that's something I could do from an authoring tool perspective. I think that would be really cool to do. Something that you can do from a reading tool perspective is, well, I'm not sure our AIs are good enough for this yet. I have less faith in an LLM's ability to do this, but it would be kind of cool if it had a sense of some of the things that you had written in the past and some of the formalisms that you were very familiar with, and maybe it could do some rewriting of that expression, those expressions on your behalf. What it might be able to do a little bit more easily is find another reference that introduces that particular formula in a very approachable way. And maybe then it can divert you there where you can spend, 10 or 20 dedicated minutes trying to really familiarize yourself with that before hopping back into the original document. I think the reading side of things is a little bit trickier, but I do think that, like, as we get these more and more powerful LLMs, I just think that their ability to do these very application-specific things is just really incredible. And I think that, like, one of the places that they could be brought to bear is to help out with things around notation communication in some of the ways like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Do you have questions or? Okay. Yeah, so I also have a couple more questions, and then this kind of on topic since we're talking about LLMs. I think one, just following your thought here, I think designing math equations or notations is kind of like a design process, right? Which is like you are trying to convey your thoughts, and then in this specific, like domain-specific language in terms of notations and equations, right? And I feel like, think about like the common design practice. When you start to design something visually and we making a figure, one way people usually do is to search for relevant figures in the word, and then they just try to figure out, okay, they can pick some inspirations from this figures and design, and then imbued into their current design, right? But then for maths, I feel like this is kind of like tricky process, which is like, people, there's no such tool for people to search equations. That's the first place, right? And then such that people usually just turn to some familiar materials they know, and then maybe some like common practices they're familiar with. But in the end, I think there's a missing piece in this like whole design process, which is like, how to really, building such a like platform or maybe like toolkit for people to really search inspirations or search for references for math designs. I think that could be like one solution to the problems that we're just chatting about, saying that how to align these equations from different sources, I guess.
Yeah, totally. I think that is an excellent point. And I think math search has historically been a pretty difficult problem. Richard Zanibi has done a ton of work in this space of trying to index math formulas and then come up with different mechanisms for people to query across those, formula databases. I think it has been difficult to, as I understand, as I perceive it in that research area, it is difficult to index formulas in a way that supports natural query mechanisms. And at the same time, you can also imagine that, like, I guess, if someone is querying one of those databases and they provide, for instance, like maybe a fragment of the kind of formula that they're trying to write, like, what documents do you want to search over? Like, I guess you probably want to search over some of the research papers that you've gotten that over the past years. I think, to date, these databases go review a very sweeping set of documents, at which point, like, you just get this long tail of results, and figuring out how to prioritize between them is pretty difficult. And so, I think that's a great point. There's been a bunch of research on it historically. I'm not sure if there's a solution to it yet, but I think it's great that you pointed out, and I think, like, it would be really cool to have that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And then the question is about, like, how large language models can assist people in the understanding of these equations. But I'm not trying to say, oh, this large language models can generate like descriptions, because we know they tend to hallucinate, they tend to do something like less trustworthy, and then you can really not trust generation. But I mean explanation in a way along the line of what you discuss here, which is sometimes just adding the simple visual clues can just like, I don't know, I mentioned about this, like, you want to create layers, in terms of your visual communication, such that you want to emphasize and de-emphasize some certain points, such that it can easily make people to find the correspondence and then enable better understanding in some ways, right? And I feel like, I guess, after seeing FFL and then all the like math augmentation, I feel like there might be some ways, large language models can help this explanation in a different way than purely simply generating more text. And I'm just curious about your thoughts here in terms of how it could happen. Maybe what are the possible directions here? Yeah.
Sure. So first, I'll say that I wouldn't necessarily close the book on LLMs as generative of definitions. I think, I've seen some pretty surprising capabilities from them when I've just passed it some LaTeX, even out of context, and asked it what the expressions might mean. In fact, one of the things that you can ask it to do is even extract those expressions and explain them individually. And I think you might be surprised by some of its capabilities there. So I don't think that we should rule it out. Of course, as in all domains, we want to understand the severity of the hallucinations and only deploy it in circumstances where the hallucination rate is acceptable.
Yeah.
But what you describe it in terms of like, what are some of the other things that you can do in order to assist people with augmentation? I think a lot of things. If you think about the process of augmentation is identifying meaningful expressions, surrounding them with some additional markup, and then finding, relevant parts of the text elsewhere that you're also going to mark up, then, simply finding something. So there are a few things that you could try to delegate to some type of assistant. One of those is identifying those expressions. Another one is identifying appearances of those expressions elsewhere in the text. And then I guess another one would be like maybe other types of fine-grained presentation issues, like what set of colors do you assign to these that are going to be like colorblind friendly and easy to distinguish from each other? I think all of those things are things that you could delegate to an assistant. The one that I'm least sure about is the ability of an assistant to be able to detect meaningful chunks within a formula, but I think it might well be able to do that, and especially if you provided it with the text that described it, which sometimes also describes individual symbols and groups of those symbols that are meaningful. That might be a huge help to any type of AI-based system that's trying to chunk a formula. So I guess the short answer to your question is chunking, marking up, and fine-grained visual design choices, I think, are all apt targets.
Yeah, thank you so much. These are like excellent like strategies and then design space we can think about. All right, so maybe one last time, do you have more questions? Or yeah, I guess like that's all from the audience. And then really want to say thank you, Andrew. This is amazing talk. Really learned a lot from that, really enjoyed that. And then thanks for you all for the questions. And then maybe we can stop here and then thanks.
Great, yes, and if I can make one final plug, so this has been a lot of fun. It's been really great to have this lively discussion and to hear some of y'all's thoughts. If any of you are interested in this, either as an idea to play around with in your own scholarly communications, or also as a research direction, please just consider me an open book. I would be really happy to chat some more and brainstorm ideas in either direction. So thank you everyone for the lively discussion.
Awesome, thank you so much. Yep, great.
Okay.
Right, see you, Andrew. Yeah,
thank you so much for the invitation, Shannon.
Of course, yeah. Thank you, and then talk to you soon again. Yeah.
Okay, take care.